Hello, and welcome to the Restart Michigan webinar, Optimizing Reentry for Your Workforce and Workspace. I am Lori Ostro, Senior Director of Engagement with the Detroit Regional Chamber, and I thank you for joining today's session. The Chamber launched this series of webinars to help businesses across the state prepare to restart their operations and return to work. I would like to thank our guest speakers from Deloitte for volunteering their time to share their expertise. Before we get started, I wanted to remind everyone that all the participants are on mute. You will have the option to submit questions through the question panel on the control panel you will see on your screen. I will now turn the webinar over to David Parent from Deloitte. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. This is David Parent. I'm our managing principal for Deloitte here in the state of Michigan, representing our 1,200 or so employees in our offices in Detroit, Grand Rapids, Lansing, and Midland. I'd like to thank the Chamber for hosting us again. This is our third webinar on the topics of COVID recovery and COVID strategies. Our first focused on workforce strategies in particular. Our second webinar focused on finance and CFO considerations and strategies. Today we'll cover some similar topics with a bit more of a flavor on workplace and real estate considerations as part of COVID recovery and response as well. As Lori mentioned, the session is being recorded for those who are not able to attend for the full hour, or if you'd like to share with your colleagues what you hear today. There is Q&A. You can submit your questions using the control feature at the right and entering your questions. We will pause at a couple points during the presentation to review the questions that have come in, and we also have time reserved at the end to do Q&A as well. There are 3 handouts that you can access on the Chamber website, or using the control features at the far right. You can see PDFs under handouts that share some additional information and detail to what my colleague will present today. And I'd like to introduce my colleague Darin Buelow, who has volunteered his time to talk to all of us today. Darin is a leader in our real estate and location strategy practice. He ties not only workplace considerations, but connects those to workforce considerations, to business strategy considerations, financial considerations, and will provide a good overview of a number of topics and approaches that we're helping clients with directly as they think about their COVID response and recovery. So with no further ado, Darin, thanks again for volunteering to do the session today, and I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, David. It's great to be with you. Thank you to Lori and everyone at the Chamber for the opportunity to connect with you today and speak a bit about reentry for workforce and workplace. Our agenda for this morning is broken up into 4 different sections. First off, exploring a bit about what we're hearing from clients in terms of transitioning from response to recovery and how companies are framing up the decisions that they need to make. We'll spend some time reviewing again some of the workforce strategies that companies are employing, speak a bit about scenario planning, very important in this day and age to look at different options and different scenarios, and then workplace reentry considerations, including costs and what some of the cost parameters are shaping up to be based on how companies are making choices for real estate, health and safety, and workplace reentry. So that in a nutshell is what we'll cover. We'll leave time at the end for Q&A. Again, as Lori and David indicated, if you've got a question, I think there's a question feature through this GoToWebinar platform that we're on. Please feel free to share your questions. So in COVID times, in addition to the role that I have at Deloitte in our real estate and location strategy practice, it's been a lot about COVID recovery and helping companies understand what they need to do to plan for recovery, what kind of action and steps that they need to take in order to prepare the workforce and the workplace. Through the course of the last 2 months, we've had a chance to connect with over 100 companies and have very rich and detailed discussions about what they're seeing, what they're doing, what they're hypothesizing. And I wanted to spend a few minutes and just share some of the summary findings from those conversations. The first one here is 35%. In essence, what COVID has done is accelerate the acceptance rate of work remote or work from home. Now, certainly, we all know some employees are not thriving in work from home environments, but many others are. And many minds have been changed at the corporate level in terms of whether or not this is sustainable long term. What we're hearing from companies, this 35%, is that is the figure of the pre-COVID office workforce that they would expect to be able to work remotely long term. If true, if companies can actually achieve numbers like that, even if it's 20%, 25%, 30%, that'll have a significant shift in terms of real estate markets in especially downtown U.S. cities. We know that not everybody is going to be 100% remote or 100% in the office. There'll be quite a few people in between, but this could result in seat reductions of 30, 35% as leases expire, as companies give space back to landlords over the next 5 to 10 years, if that hypothesis holds true. We all know of examples of companies that have come out publicly and said numbers even greater than that. Nationwide Insurance has said 50% of their workforce will be remote from now on. Tata in India has said, look, globally, we've been operating under a real estate and workforce model that's 20 years old. We're going to have 75% of our workforce not reporting to an office every day. And then even Twitter and Halliburton, companies like that have announced 100% of their workforce will be remote. They won't be coming back to corporate offices forever and ever, amen. For every one of those, of course, there's companies that are far lower on the scale. But that 35% number seems to be holding, and that's something that companies will be trying to strive for. The second icon here, 2.5 hours, that's an elevator distancing figure. One anecdote of a company with 3,000 employees in a high-rise building worked with their elevator contractor to provide a simulation. How long would it take, based on our average pre-COVID daily occupancy, how long would it take for us to just load the building in the morning? Without regard to temperature testing in the lobby or other kinds of security protocols, just to navigate the elevators in this high-rise building. And the simulation came up with 2.5 hours every morning just to get people onto their floors of work. Of course, that means 2.5 hours every afternoon just to get people back to the lobby, and probably a bit of a mess over the lunch hour. So this is obviously not something that's sustainable. We know from our own discussions with elevator contractors that reducing capacity to 1 person, 2 people, 3 people, 4 people in most elevators will significantly lengthen the amount of time it takes to load buildings. One estimate is anywhere from 8 times down to 6 times as long to load a building. We know from our own simulations in one of Deloitte's offices, a large number of employees, it could take up to 4 hours to load the building. And obviously, even if we only bring back half of the people, that's still 2 hours to load the building. After experiencing that on a Monday, it's doubtful that employees will show up on Tuesday to go through that again. So elevators are going to be a big limiting factor for those companies in urban markets, in high-rise office buildings. The elevators will be a bit of a problem. To achieve occupancy greater than 15, 20, 25%, it's going to be one of the constraints. August 2021, this is an anecdote from the COO of a major North American bank, who said back in late April, he would feel blessed if he could get 40% of his workforce back in the office by August of 2021. A very conservative statement at the time, not one that was necessarily repeated in the media, but yet an indication that corporate leaders, and we're witnessing this as we see more companies delay re-entry into buildings, an indicator that many corporate leaders are taking a conservative approach. Slow, careful, and steady seems to be the philosophy of the day in terms of re-entry for most companies. Not all, but the vast majority taking their time, putting the safety and health of employees first, and really being measured about how they re-enter. The August of 2021 date by this particular company is driven in part by that individual's perspective of when vaccines may be widely distributed and available, of also a reflection of the fact that many employees need to take public transportation to work, which is another densification issue, elevator distancing, getting police and fire, EMTs, restaurants, all of the services that you need to have in place in order for hundreds of thousands of people to make that commute and do so safely and just get fed every day. Without that infrastructure up in place, it's going to be difficult to come back en masse. And then finally, 25%, as we've asked these companies about their loading plans, it does appear that there's some consistency that many, if not most of them, are planning on a wave one or a phase one to be capped at 25%. And the way that they're thinking about that is by and large, most companies are suggesting that re-entry into the office can be an opt-in. It can be something that they would like employees to volunteer for. They're not necessarily going to force their employees to come back. But they'd like the employees to reflect on these questions. Number one, if the employee is in a high-risk category, above a certain age, or has a pre-existing condition, the employer would prefer that the employee not be part of that first wave. Second condition, if they have to take public transportation to work, they prefer that they stay home in this first wave. And then third, if they meet those two criteria, ask themselves, do they feel safe? If they don't feel safe coming into the office, if they feel like they're placing their own health or the health of their family at risk by showing up to work in the office, they prefer that the employee stays home. So in that way, these companies are able to sort down to a much lower number of occupants that would be opting in to be part of this first wave. So that's a little sense of what we're hearing from clients. I'm going to share more stories as we go along this morning, but just wanted to start with that. So in terms of framing up what this crisis response has looked like for companies, in essence, we've got this three-stage framework of crisis management: respond, recover, and thrive. And most companies are fairly the way through the response phase. They've pivoted to work from home. They've sorted their technology or confidentiality or printing issues that some employees have, depending on the complexity of the work and the nature of the work. And they're starting to have an eye towards recover. And we've got this insertion of reboot between respond and recover. And what reboot is this is the positioning for recovery. This is establishing the plan to minimize risk to the workforce, make sure the productivity continues unmitigated, and enabling companies and their employees to serve customers. We break down reboot into three different components: rebooting the work, the workforce, and the workplace. And this is all about adapting to new ways of working, safely and effectively bringing the workforce back to the office, and then preparing the office in terms of what needs to get done, what tools and accelerators have to be put in place to enable collaboration and promote safety. One thing that does seem to be consistent across the conversations we've had with these over 100 companies is the importance of health and safety. We have yet to speak to a company that's not prioritizing health and safety above everything else. We're going to talk a little bit about costs later on this morning, but I just want to be clear: companies aren't making that trade. The drive to understand the costs of reentry is simply for planning purposes, but they're absolutely placing health and safety first. So this is what reboot looks like, and as we help companies think through reboot, I do want to focus on the occupier side of this. We may have some landlords and real estate investors, real estate owners on this call. And as we think about the challenges faced by landlords as well as occupiers, we'll cover off on some of the shared space and shared ground between those two. But the reboot for the occupiers is where I want to focus most of our comments this morning. And this is because these occupiers are the ones that have the thousands of employees that need to get back to these offices. So what we're learning is, I mentioned the opt-in basis. I mentioned the the prioritization of health and safety. This full journey of Reboot is expected to occur over multiple phases and may kind of have fits and starts. We're going to be in a clunky period, it seems, in the United States for the months and maybe the quarters to come. And we're watching and witnessing that what happens in company global offices is going to happen and take place at a different pace than what we're experiencing here in the US. So the key questions that companies need to ask themselves here at the bottom: when can we reboot? How are we ready to reboot? How do we reboot? And how do we spur and maintain recovery? And drilling into these, the whole question of when is generally based on macro conditions, things that are somewhat outside the control of the company themselves, legal issues, what's happening at the state and local level from a regulatory perspective, what are the health guidelines, what does the spread of the pandemic look like, new cases, risk appetite, all of those things playing into the question of when. Employee surveys, which we're going to talk about this morning as well, is another big aspect of driving when. The employee surveys that we've done and that we've seen others do, there is a significant portion of the workforce, the office-based workforce, that is just not ready to come back until a vaccine is in place, and that could be well over a year from now, if hopefully sooner, but we'll see. Are we ready to reboot? This is the micro conditions of making sure that the company is ready from a cross-functional perspective: employee health and safety, HR, change management and comms, financial, legal, facilities and infrastructure. How do we reboot? This is all about the choices, the phases. How are we going to bring people back in waves? Are we going to stagger seating? Are we going to have a Monday, Wednesday, and every other Friday, and a Tuesday, Thursday, and every other Friday? Who's first and who's last? And then finally, spurring recovery is about KPIs, technology, and making sure that the ongoing safety and health of the employees is achieved with the decisions that the company makes. So this is the journey to reboot. Hopefully this is helpful for just kind of framing up how you can look at reentry. And then focusing on these three areas, making sure that the workforce, and workplace aspects are all in balance. This is an opportunity to review what the work is. What is the future of that work? How is our work getting done? Do we have work that's spread across 17 different employees that if we strip out some aspect of that work and consolidate it into one or two people, can it be done more efficiently? Are there new ways of working with automation and augmentation that we can take advantage of? The workforce is about who does it: contractors, gig economy, outsourced, insourced, captive, remote, offshore. The who is a big question here. And what's really interesting about COVID times is that companies are beginning to realize that if they've got some aspect of their work that can be done remotely, it might be able to be done by workers across the country. And maybe they can hire workers in states where they don't have a presence, but they can tap into new talent pools for specific STEM and technical requirements. And then workplace, obviously we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. Okay, so let's get into this. So we've set the framing, we've covered off on reboot and respond and recover. We're going to spend a few minutes talking now about workforce strategies and how companies can determine who should return to the office and who might likely be able to work from home remotely. Some of this may be similar to what we heard about on the Restart Michigan webinar number 1, where we talked about workforce issues. I do want to emphasize a few things here. Number 1, this bell curve. As companies look at their jobs and functions and roles within the organization and begin to evaluate whether or not the work can be done remotely or could be done or has to be done in the office, most companies are gonna have an employee population that looks like a bell curve. And that means that for some functions, they will just quite obviously have to be done in the office. Facilities management functions, mail services functions, no-brainers, don't even need to evaluate them. And some roles will quite obviously need to be done outside of the office. Field service reps, field sales reps, relationship managers, people who didn't really show up in the office much anyway, again, maybe no-brainers. They can continue to work at home. But it's all of these roles in the middle: finance, accounting, IT, procurement, HR, and many, many others that companies need to spend time evaluating. And this is done with combining a couple of different tools. One of those tools is deep dive labor analytics, to look at the function, the work itself, and the roles, not just the overall function, but delving into the function. And then the other aspect is employee surveys, asking people about their ability to work from home. And this combines, on the left side of this page, the business factors that go into the work and the roles, along with personal factors. And what's often missed when companies make decisions about must work in the office versus can work outside the office are these personal factors. We know from experience during pre-COVID times, as well as during COVID times, that some people are able to do their best work from home, and some people are not able to do their best work from home. Some people have a overly distracted environment. Their Wi-Fi is not up to snuff. They may be sharing a living space with an employee at a competing firm, and it makes it very difficult for them to have confidential web calls or Zoom calls at the same time. There can be any number of reasons why somebody is not as productive at home as they might be in the office. Their own personal style of work. Some people just do better in an office environment, and we have to acknowledge that. But the opposite is true as well. Some people are reporting in surveys that they're quite pleased with not having to commute, avoiding the cost and the time of the commute. They're being much more productive in terms of what they're able to get done, how many sales calls they can actually undertake in a day or in a week by not having to travel. And so mixing the business factors with the personal factors is the approach here that we advocate. One of the tools that Deloitte has to help with the assessment of the work itself is called Future of Talent Optimization, or the FOTO tool. And the FOTO tool takes a look at a company's roles and jobs and work and compares it to industry averages, industry benchmarks, industry data for those same roles, functions, and work. Looking at jobs at the task level and understanding the amount of collaboration, the amount of solo work that is done in every aspect of a job, and being able to look at different alternatives for doing that work, whether it's different talent models or automation. This is a highly analytical approach that companies can use to unlock this so-called what is the art of the possible? What could we do? How could we migrate to the future of work and use this opportunity to catalyze how we're working? Some of that output looks like this. So looking at just one particular function for one company, we uncovered that fully over a third of the accounting function could easily be done remote with remote workers, people who work from home. Yet another just under a third really needed to be done on site, and another third is almost a hybrid model where employees might be coming into the office 1 to 3 days a week, maybe 4 days a week, maybe the next week 4 days at home. So that's what hybrid is, and it varies by job level as well. This is the danger of looking at an entire function and making sweeping decisions without looking at the sub roles and the individuals within that function. You get slightly different answers depending on the level. So in combination with tools like FOTO, using workforce and workplace surveys is really key. Most companies by now have already pushed out at least one pulse survey to their employees to find out how is it going working from home, how productive do people feel, when might they be ready to come back to the workforce. There's a couple of things here with these surveys. Number one, it's really important for companies to repeat the survey at least monthly, so that they get a pulse on with changing sentiment, changing conditions in the cities in which the employees live, the changing national narrative about how we're doing against fighting the pandemic. that can change people's opinions. And so repeating the pulse survey, this isn't something that's just a one and done, but asking the same questions repeatedly over time can really help companies make better decisions. And then two, it's really important to design these surveys so that you can tease out how productive, how effective employees are in their current role working from home. This is an opportunity to use these surveys to help inform the longer term decisions about work from home, work remote. It would be very difficult for companies to achieve that 35% work from home permanent post-COVID without having an understanding of by role, by individual, the capability and the readiness of their workforce to be able to stay at home. So these surveys are just super important, and a couple of best practices here that we wanted to share. Okay, so we've spoken about workforce. Let's now talk a little bit about scenario planning. What I mean by scenario planning is equipping your company with the ability to pull different levers and look at different variables, both macro variables and micro variables, in order to understand the implications, the scenario implications of different return decisions. And let me give you an example of what I mean. Once you've got a scenario framework built up, you can start to vary different inputs. You can vary which facilities and which floors will be open and closed. You can vary the timing of that. You can vary the occupancy limits you might set. How much spacing will we have on the floor? Will we cap things at 25%? Do we have elevator distancing constrained floors that will prevent us even from getting to 25%? We can also vary the severity of the pandemic. For instance, we can use these scenario tools to hypothesize when vaccination might be widespread available, and what might that mean to our return? What might that mean to how many people we would want to plan for by month in the future? What would the availability of PPE, availability and reliability of testing do? Again, based on what you're learning from your pulse surveys and the conditions that people are asking for to be in place before they return, you can only really understand the CapEx and OpEx impacts of workplace reentry using scenario models like this. Not necessarily rocket science, but definitely heavy lifting. Definitely roll up your sleeves, getting down into the weeds, building models that portray each of your sites in terms of occupancy, real estate cost, reentry cost, and being able to understand the CapEx and OpEx impacts. So one of the levers that one of our clients is evaluating is whether or not to spend money on barriers on the cube floors, sneeze guards, fiberglass barriers. What would the cost of that be versus removing chairs from the floor and achieving similar distancing? Maybe they'd have to remove more chairs. They can occupy fewer seats without the barriers, but it might cost them less. So running that trade-off. And other companies looking at ventilation improvements to the building. This is another key aspect that occupiers need to work with their landlords on is the cost of ventilation improvements and what might that look like. So scenario planning is a way through this. Also, looking at different ways to portray what return waiving might look like. So in this particular example, this is a framework to help companies decide what segments of their employee population might best return in a wave 1 in green, in a wave 2 in light blue, in a wave 3 in dark blue, and which segments might likely be best positioned to continue to work from home, at least for the time being. So the way that this particular chart looks like, and this is just illustrative, yours may and will be different. Taking a look at the pre-COVID office population and looking at those that were already work from home, those that were already office-based, and those that were kind of something in between, sometimes in the office, sometimes at home. looking at the employee sentiment survey to assess whether they're productive virtually. They're all working from home now, let's say, or 95% of them are. Are they virtually productive or not? Are they able to return to work or not, either because of personal circumstances or personal sentiment? What's their readiness and willingness to return to the office? And then for those that are ready to return to the office, does that local office location even have the capacity for their return? And that's results based on scenario models. So as further waves might open up further capacity in the office, we want to give companies the opportunity to do wave planning. And a flow chart like this is really helpful for that kind of purpose. The outputs of the scenario planning exercise should offer to management opportunities to make decisions. And those decisions need to be about capital and OpEx expense, timing, how much space will we need based on different physical distancing decisions, what's really our total occupiable capacity in our offices, how much will the different decisions we have to make affect our overall operating expense, and ultimately how many people can we safely accommodate. So when viewed in this framework, it really brings to light that there are different options, there are different choices that companies need to make, and there's implications to those choices from a timing and cost perspective. Okay, so we've had a chance to chat about workforce issues. We've had a chance to speak about workforce and workplace scenario planning. Now let's get really tactical and talk about workplace reentry. First off, we wanted to arm you with some sample guiding principles for reentry planning. And these could be suitable for how you approach building your own team for reentry planning, what the philosophy of the program is going to be, or maybe even how you communicate to your employees. So many companies have this sorted, but for those of you that haven't, hopefully there's some ideas here. First of all, we know that most companies are communicating appropriately that the safety of people comes first, and prioritizing that safety is really important in change management and comms. We believe also that companies should communicate very frequently, tell employees what you know when you know it, communicate with a lot of transparency and in an honest way. Messages from the top certainly help, video messages or all hands calls, video calls. Third, making sure that employees understand this is an opportunity to improve how we work with one another and improve the human experience of working together while being separate. Not everybody's viewing the current COVID times in terms of a workplace or workforce experience as a catalyst, but it really is forcing all of us to work a little bit differently. And I think we're learning some lessons here that can help us in the long term. Fourth and fifth, maybe some things you maybe haven't thought about, and that is number 4, making sure that the workforce understands that the company is going to prioritize their needs over just the fact that they may have empty space sitting somewhere and they feel the need to fill it up. So in other words, people decisions are going to take priority over place decisions or real estate decisions. Talent decisions need to drive real estate, not the other way around. Strategy should drive these tactics. And then finally, making sure that employees have a sense that management is listening and that there's a feedback loop in place. Employees can give perspectives on how they feel about their reentry and offer suggestions. Those suggestions will be heard and the company can pivot as needed. So just a few guiding principles for your consideration. When we think about reentry planning, we want clients and companies to view things through this particular framework. This framework encapsulates 4 different areas: workforce areas, facility readiness areas, building operations areas, and health and safety areas. It's supported by the enablers at the bottom: governance, technology, policies and procedures, and communications. Let me take a pause here. I know we've got one particular question that's come up, and David, I'm gonna try to get to that question. I think you
I
were
can,
thinking, or
yeah,
you've got the
yeah.
question. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Darin. I thought this would be a good place to ask. So to paraphrase the question, of course, in the chamber, we have representatives of global organizations, national organizations, and Michigan-focused organizations. To paraphrase the question, it's in essence asking, how in this framework do you advise thinking about the government direction? Presumably at the state level, there's different direction in different states. In Michigan, at least I think a good part of the state is in what's called stage 4. And there's still pretty clear guidance around different industries, different kinds of work, including guidance such as those who can work remotely should continue to do so for more office type of work, for example. So I guess in general, the question would just be, how do you advise organizations to factor in, of course, the government direction while also thinking about the workforce and the business needs and so on?
Yeah, it's a great question. First off, we advise companies to absolutely comply with state and local guidance. From our conversations with these companies, they are viewing that guidance as table stakes, as the bare minimum. And company policy in almost all cases is going over and above what the government mandate may be. So companies are being generally quite a bit more cautious and careful in terms of reentry planning. Just because the government may say it's okay for offices to reopen in some limited capacity, we're not seeing occupancy numbers across the U.S. in very high stages right now. So that's the answer to the question is viewing, certainly complying with all state and local, but also viewing that as a minimum requirement, with companies typically choosing to go over and above. Let me spend a second here and talk about what occupancy statistics are looking like right now across the U.S. We know of a key card entry company that measures badge swipes across 3,600 buildings across the U.S. And so they've got pre-COVID data, and then they're monitoring what badge swiping is looking like in those 3,600 buildings, and they're sharing that data across 10 major cities. So we can see city by city what occupancy looks like and what it has looked like every week going back to early March. The average across 10 major American cities right now is 21.6% in terms of badge swiping into these office buildings, with the assumption that pre-COVID it was 90 to 100%. Some cities are greater than 21%, some cities are less. New York right now is the lowest in the United States. Occupancy in New York is right around 10%, badge swipe data. The highest is places like Dallas and Houston, where they're kind of well above 21% still, 25, 28%. But basically all the other cities in the country that this company tracks, Chicago and San Antonio, others, they're San Francisco, it's between 10 and 25%. So it's still a long way to go for reentry. Hopefully that answers your question about compliance with government requirements. And absolutely, there's a lot of variation between what's happening in the US and global experience. Coming back to reentry planning, we're seeing companies get organized for their reentry plan with task forces across these 4 different pillars. The workforce team needs to evaluate and make decisions around the shifts, staggered return, who's going to come back and when, as well as what kind of training needs to happen. What does day 1 look like for me as an employee when I first come back? What can I expect? There's a lot of HR aspects there that need to be sorted. The facility team, getting the facility ready. This is about assessing what's going to change in terms of the floor plan, the infrastructure, doing the scenario planning and all the different choices around amenities and building sanitation, etc. Working with landlords to modify building systems, coming up with new protocols for facility cleaning and floor plan circulation, etc. We're seeing companies, for example, choose to disconnect the air dryers in bathrooms and putting out a stack of paper towels again, kind of going back old school. Maybe the casualty is temporarily the environmental aspects of office occupancy, as we kind of are returning to single-use styrofoam cups, paper cups, rather than trying to wash coffee mugs and going back to paper towels in the bathrooms. So all those decisions need to be made by the facilities team. The building operations team is kind of related, but is like, how is the building going to function? What's our plan going to be for the lobby? Who's going to govern access to the lobby? Who's going to handle building systems management, the different vendors that we bring into the building? What will their service level agreements be? Do we need different workplace technologies, either to measure occupancy or utilization of our space? And then finally, a team that's set up just for health and safety. So this is working with employee health and safety, figuring out signage, PPE, whether or not companies should have on-site temperature checks. Are we going to do contact tracing? Are we going to do case management to manage the health data of employees that we are going to do temperature checks on? We know of one financial services firm that is doing daily temperature checks in the parking lot as employees arrive, and they're intercepting employees that have a fever, 2 or 3 of them every week, and telling them that you need to go back home. So lots of health and safety issues to get right. On the supporting enablers here at the bottom, the ones that I would really emphasize are the policies and procedures and communications. There will need to be new company policies and procedures for social distancing, for work from home, for visitor and occupant access. What's the policy going to be if I contract a fever at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 14th floor? Who do I notify? Where do I go? What happens next? So a lot of new kind of thinking about policies that companies have to wrestle down. And then communications, persistent, constant change management and communications about what reentry is planned, what the reentry is going to look like, what trainings employees need to take, what the new policies and procedures are. In terms of coordinating with landlords, this is a really important topic. Many companies have started to outreach to their landlords. Some of them have sent them a questionnaire because they occupy 20 or 30 offices across the country. There's a lot of data, a lot of relationships that they need to kind of refresh. Our view is that there's some aspects of COVID planning that should be predominantly in the wheelhouse of the landlord, and other aspects that are obviously going to be in the wheelhouse of the tenant. But it's this shared ground in the middle that we need more companies to collaborate with their landlords on. Collaborating with their landlords on what, first of all, how are we going to navigate our elevators? What's the policy going to be in our building? What has the landlord reached out to all the other multiple tenants in the building to find out what their reentry plans are? Who's handling the lobby? Are we going to do testing in the lobby? What's happening with bathroom and restroom sanitation? What's that process look like? What's the policy going to be? What's our policy with the landlord relative to wearing PPE in the lobby? So there's a lot of topics here that need to be fleshed out between landlords and tenants. And I'm of the view that if companies really are going to try to keep a third of their workforce working at home long-term post-COVID, and this may result in potentially a third of the seats being reduced, landlords should be very motivated to work with their tenants. And this is an opportunity for them to build relationships, to demonstrate proactive desire to maintain tenancy and really collaborate. So thinking about costs, there are a number of different choices that companies need to make in terms of cost implications. So we would break these down into these three categories: health and safety choices, facilities choices, and technology choices. If you look at these slider bars, looking at the kind of the middle of the road costs for the typical decisions a lot of companies are making relative to PPE, relative to doing screening and testing, all the way over to the far right, where some companies are engaging with third-party healthcare providers, nurses, to be the ones to do the temperature checks, be the ones to do the COVID testing on site. That's more expensive. And so depending on the choices that companies make, whether they're going to issue PPE or have third-party nurses or not, the costs per returning employee per year is what we're looking at. So for health and safety, you could be looking at upwards of over $5,000 per returning employee from an annual cost perspective, just to navigate some of the health and safety choices. From a facilities perspective, this is largely additional cleaning and sanitation, the janitorial piece, cleaning of the lobby and the common areas that may get passed back to the tenants from the landlord, as well as additional signage. That, you know, all of this from an average perspective, kind of middle of the road, about $1,700 per returning employee, all the way up to almost $3,000 we've seen per returning employee. And then the technology piece of this is really, is there a stipend for work from home? For those workers that are continuing to stay at home, will the company provide an annual stipend to help them defray the costs for internet, home office expenses, and cell phone? All told, these costs, let's add up the middle column here, 3,000 plus 1,700 plus another $100. So that's about $4,800, $4,900. If we imagine that the average U.S. occupancy cost per employee is anywhere from $8,000 a year to $12,000 or $15,000 a year, tacking on another $5,000 is a significant bump. That's almost a 40%, 45% increase in total cost of occupancy to navigate COVID times. So that's our last slide of content. David, let me turn it back over to you for Q&A. I'm not sure if we've got any questions on the tool, but let's take a look.
Yeah, thank you, Darin, and really nice presentation. I think you brought to light a lot of different perspectives from your experiences speaking to real clients and a lot of good national perspectives. A couple questions that have come in, and for those who would like to stay on, you can feel free to use the question feature in the go-to tool on the right side of your screen. Couple questions. One was, Darin, regarding the study you mentioned of folks accessing office space in a number of markets across the country. Basically, someone's asking for more information about that study, if that's a study we can share or at least provide the citation. Sounds like at least one person would be interested in more information about that study.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I should have mentioned it. It's by a badge key card company called Castle, KASTLE.com. And Castle, they're basically in this business of providing access cards. So go to that website, Castle.com, Castle with a K, and you'll be able to look at their city by city data. It's a great chart, and you can see how things have really kind of changed and been choppy over these cities as they've tried to improve occupancy.
Perfect, thank you. Next question is more about kind of the structure of the team or the structure of the leadership, especially in a multi-state environment. The question is, what are you seeing in terms of leadership for each category of Reboot? For example, does each site have a separate lead for different areas like PPE and screening and capacity planning, or more of a centralized or regional team driving? Any trends you've seen or best practices from your interactions?
Yeah, from our interactions, and this is another great question. Here's the trend. The trend is definitely centralized policy driven from the top and not varying by city or by site. I'm not seeing many companies. In fact, I can't think of any of the companies that we've spoken to that are allowing local site leaders to make these kinds of policy decisions relative to PPE, barriers, circulation, styrofoam cups, when to come back. This is important stuff that the CHRO, CAO, head of corporate real estate, CIO, all involved, or their direct reports involved, to govern this centrally and make decisions for the portfolio in a country like the United States.
Okay. We have time for a few more questions. If anyone would like to submit using the question feature on the right side of your screen. Let's give folks a minute, and if we don't have any further questions, then we'll bring the session to a wrap. Okay, I think we'll bring the session to a close. Darin, thanks again for delivering this great presentation. If people do have questions or follow-up, we provide our contact information here. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Lori Ostro from the Chamber. Thank you again for the opportunity to present today, and we'll talk to folks next time.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time today. It was a very compelling presentation. I enjoyed it. To all the participants, thank you for your time. You will soon receive an email from me later this afternoon with a link to this presentation, a recording of it. You can also visit our website at detroitchamber.com/COVID-19 for upcoming schedule of webinars, and also the handouts. There were handouts available in the session. They will also be on the website as well. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, and have a great day. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.